The ship dropped out of light speed with a shudder that rattled the coffee cup on Kale Morrow's desk. He caught it without looking. 12 years in the fleet had given him reflexes that worked even when his mind was somewhere else. And right now, his mind was very far away. Through the viewport, Thyra Prime filled the darkness like a jewel someone had set on fire. The capital world of the Galactic Conclave glowed with the light of 1,000 cities built on top of each other over 10,000 years. Rivers of light ran across its surface. Orbital stations hung above it like golden crowns. Ships from 100 species moved around it in patterns so old they had become traditions. Kale had never been here before. Most humans hadn't. Earth had only received observer status 3 years ago, the lowest rank the Conclave offered. It meant humanity was allowed to watch, to listen, and to speak only when spoken to. It meant they were guests in a house that would never be theirs. He straightened his uniform and looked at his reflection in the viewport glass. A tired face looked back at him. 41 years old, with lines around his eyes that hadn't been there 5 years ago. Before Verdana 3. Before the Hollow came and took everything that mattered to him in the span of one terrible night. He closed his eyes for a moment. He could still hear his daughter laughing. He could still feel his wife's hand in his. Then the memories turned dark as they always did, and he opened his eyes and pushed them back into the locked room inside his chest where he kept such things. "Commander," his communications officer said from behind him, "Thyra Prime Control is asking for our credentials." "Send them," Kale said, "and make sure they know we're here to address the full conclave." There was a pause. "Sir, they're saying observer species don't get to address the full conclave. They're offering us a slot with the Minor Concerns Committee." Kale almost smiled. Almost. "Tell them that the footage I'm carrying shows an entire human colony being eaten alive in 6 hours. Ask them if that sounds like a minor concern." It took 20 minutes, but they let him in. The conclave chamber was the most impressive room Kale had ever seen. It was carved into the heart of a mountain that had been turned to crystal by ancient Elori magic, or technology so advanced it looked like magic. The ceiling was so high that clouds formed inside it. 12 great platforms rose in a circle around a central floor, each one holding the delegation of an elder species. The platforms were sized for their occupants. Some were enormous. Some were small but radiated energy that made the air feel heavy. Kale stood on the central floor, alone, a single human in a room built for gods. He presented his case clearly and without emotion. He showed the footage from Verdana 3 and 4 other colony worlds. He showed the hollow, vast, dark, organic ships that moved like living things and consumed everything they touched. Biospheres stripped to bare rock in hours. Populations that simply ceased to exist. He showed the numbers. He showed the projections. At the current rate, every human colony outside of Earth would be gone within 2 years. He asked for help, military support, technology, even just safe passage for refugees, anything. The conclave listened. Some of them anyway. The Corvani delegation, massive beings of stone and gravity, didn't seem to be paying attention at all. The Vreth, shapeless biological entities that constantly reformed themselves, whispered among each other in wet, clicking sounds. The Thaelni delegation, crystalline beings that communicated through light, flickered in patterns that might have been boredom. When Kale finished, there was silence. Then the delegations began to speak, one by one, and each one said the same thing in different words. The Hollow were a frontier problem. Human territory was far from the galactic core. Resources should not be spent on a species that had not yet proven its value to the galactic community. It was regrettable, of course, deeply regrettable, but the conclave had to think of the greater good. Kale stood through all of it. His face showed nothing. His hands stayed at his sides. He had expected this. He had hoped he was wrong, but he had expected it. The last to speak was High Arbiter Salith Vaughn. She was a Lori, tall, thin, with skin that glowed faintly silver and eyes that burned like white stars. The Elori were the oldest of the elder species, masters of psionic power, beings who lived for thousands of years, and considered anything less than a millennium to be childhood. Salith herself was over 4,000 years old. She had watched empires rise and fall the way humans watched seasons change. She looked down at Kale from her platform high above. Her voice filled the chamber without effort, carried by psionic force that made every word land like a physical thing. "Commander Morrow," she said, and even his name sounded small in her mouth. "The Conclave has heard your petition, we have seen your evidence, and we have reached our decision." She paused. The chamber was completely silent. "You ask gods for favors, Commander. You come to this hall, to this world that was ancient before your species learned to use fire, and you ask us to fight your battles for you." Her eyes narrowed slightly. "But you are merely a human. Your kind burns bright and dies fast. You build, you break, you scream into the dark for a handful of decades, and then you are gone. The galaxy will not mourn what it barely noticed." The words hit Kale like stones, not because they were cruel, because she believed them. Every being in this room believed them. To them, humans were not enemies or threats or even rivals. They were insects, temporary, beneath concern. Kale looked up at Salith Vaughn for a long moment. Something passed across his face, not anger, not defeat, but something that made the youngest delegates on the lower platforms shift in their seats. It was the look of a man who had just finished asking nicely. He nodded once. He picked up his datapad from the podium. He turned and walked toward the exit without hurrying, his boots echoing in the vast chamber. He did not look back. Nobody tried to stop him. Nobody said goodbye. 20 minutes later, Kale sat in the command chair of his ship as it pulled away from Thyra Prime. The golden world shrank behind them. He watched it for a moment, then turned to his communications officer. "Open a classified channel to Earth. Director Osai, priority black." The channel opened. A woman's face appeared on screen, Director Lena Osai, Earth's Secretary of Defense. She was already watching him with eyes that expected the answer she got. "They said no," Kale said. His voice was quiet, calm, final. "Activate Prometheus." Osai held his gaze for 3 seconds. Then she nodded once and the screen went dark. Kale leaned back in his chair and stared at the stars. Somewhere out there, in the spaces between those stars, the Hollow were eating their way toward everything he had left to protect. And the galaxy's oldest and most powerful civilizations had just told him it wasn't their problem. That was fine. Humanity had been solving its own problems since before it came down from the trees. One more wouldn't break them. He closed his eyes. In the dark behind them, his daughter laughed. "Okay, sweetheart," he whispered. "Daddy's going to fix this." The asteroid had no name on any map. It drifted in a dead zone between 2 star systems that nobody cared about, a region of space so empty that even smugglers avoided it. On the outside, it looked like any other rock floating in the void, gray, pitted, and completely forgettable. On the inside, it was the most dangerous place in the galaxy. Forge 7 had been carved out of the asteroid's core over the course of 15 years. It was part laboratory, part factory, and part fortress. Over 3,000 of Earth's brightest scientists, engineers, and military designers lived and worked inside it. None of them had spoken to anyone outside the project in years. Their families thought they were on deep space research missions. Their governments knew only that they existed somewhere, and that the budget they consumed could have funded a small war. Kale Morrow arrived at Forge 7 2 days after leaving Thyra Prime. The docking bay was hidden behind a section of asteroid wall that slid open only when it received a signal that changed every 6 hours. Inside, the bay was clean, bright, and humming with energy. Dr. Arun Patel met him at the dock. Patel was the lead scientist of Project Prometheus, a small man with wild gray hair and the kind of eyes that never quite focused on the present because they were always looking at the future. "I watched the broadcast from the conclave," Patel said as they walked through a corridor lined with reinforced glass. Behind the glass, Massive machines moved in patterns that didn't seem to follow normal physics. That Elori woman was something else. She was honest, Kale said. That's more than most of them gave me. She told me what they all think, we're nothing to them. Patel smiled in a way that was not entirely kind. Then they're going to have a very bad surprise. He led Kale through the facility, and what Kale saw made him stop more than once to simply stare. The elder species of the galaxy had each mastered one area of science and technology. The Elori had psionics, the ability to manipulate matter and energy with their minds. The Corvani controlled gravity itself. The Vreth were masters of biological engineering, able to reshape living tissue like clay. The Thalni worked with light and energy in ways that bordered on art. Each species was supreme in its own field and average or worse in everything else. This was, Patel explained, because specialization was the natural path of evolution. When a species found something it was good at, it leaned into that strength for thousands of years until it became the only thing that defined them. They never looked sideways. They never asked what would happen if you combined two fields that had never been combined before. Humans were different. Humans were not the best at anything. They had no natural psionic ability, no control over gravity, no biological mastery. By the standards of the elder species, they were blank, empty, unspecialized. And that, Patel said with a grin that split his face in half, was exactly the point. For decades, humanity had been collecting. Every trade deal with an elder species, every diplomatic visit, every cultural exchange. It was all a cover for the most ambitious intelligence operation in human history. Fragments of Elori psionic technology stolen from a crashed diplomatic shuttle. Corvani gravitational equations bought from a disgraced scientist. Vreth biological samples traded through black markets that the Vreth didn't even know existed. Thalni energy matrices, copied from a museum exhibit during a diplomatic tour. No single fragment was enough to do anything useful, but humans didn't think in fragments. They thought in connections. Project Prometheus had taken pieces from every elder species discipline and done what no species in the galaxy had ever attempted. It had combined them. Psionic amplifiers powered by gravitational cores, biological armor that repaired itself using light energy absorption, ship drives that bent space by using living tissue as a computational matrix. The results were things that shouldn't exist. Kale stood in a hangar the size of a small city and looked up at the warships. They were beautiful and terrible at the same time. Their hulls were dark, almost organic, covered in patterns that shifted like living skin. They were smaller than elder species capital ships, but something about them felt heavier, more present, as if they pressed against reality itself. The Cascade Lance, Patel said, pointing to a weapon mounted on the lead ship's spine. It was a long, spiraling structure that seemed to twist in directions the eye couldn't follow. It opens a crack between dimensions and forces the energy of one reality into another. Anything caught in the beam doesn't just get destroyed. It gets removed from existence. Kale stared at it. How many do we have? 47 ships fully equipped, another 100 in various stages of completion, and 12,000 sets of infantry exoframes. The exoframes were perhaps even more impressive than the ships. They were suits of powered armor that merged psionic amplification with raw physical force. A single human soldier in an exoframe could match the strength of a Corvani warrior, the reflexes of an Elori adept, and the endurance of a Vreth biosoldier. Not as well as the originals in their specialty, but good enough in all of them at once. That was humanity's real weapon. Not any single advantage, but all of them together. The elder species were masters of their own domains. Humans were students of every domain, and a student who studied everything could see connections that masters never imagined. Kale spent 3 days at Forge 7. He reviewed every system, every weapon, every tactical projection. He met the soldiers who would pilot the ships and wear the armor. They were young, most of them, young and scared and ready. They knew what the Hollow had done to the frontier colonies. Many of them had lost people. All of them had volunteered. On the second night, Cale sat alone in his quarters and looked at a photograph he kept in his pocket. His wife Mara, his daughter Elise. They were standing in front of their house on Verdana 3, smiling in sunlight that no longer existed. The colony was gone. The sunlight was gone. They were gone. He had been off-world when the Hollow came. By the time he got back, there was nothing left. Not ruins, not bodies, nothing. The Hollow didn't leave remains. They consumed everything: structures, people, soil, atmosphere. Verdana 3 was now a bare rock spinning in space, smooth and empty as a skull. Cale put the photograph away and closed his eyes. He didn't cry. He hadn't cried in 5 years. The tears had dried up somewhere along the way and been replaced by something harder, something that kept him standing when his body wanted to fall. Some people called it strength. Cale knew it was just stubbornness. The human refusal to stop when stopping made sense. On the third day, Director Osai transmitted the activation order to every human military installation in the galaxy. It was simple and clear. The Conclave has denied our request for assistance. The elder species have decided that our survival is not their concern. Effective immediately, Project Prometheus is fully operational. All assets are to deploy to assigned positions. All personnel are to report to their commanders. There was a pause in the transmission, and when Osai spoke again, her voice was quieter but no less steady. We asked for help because it was the right thing to do. They said no because they think we don't matter. We're going to show them what it looks like when something that doesn't matter refuses to die. Across human space, ships launched, soldiers suited up, and colony defenses came online with systems that had been hidden behind false walls and dummy power grids for years. The galaxy's youngest species bared its teeth. Meanwhile, on Thyra Prime, Salith Vaughn sat in her private chambers and reviewed an intelligence report from her agents in human space. Unusual energy readings. Massive power spikes from regions that should have been empty. Ship movements that didn't match any known human technology profile. She read the report twice, then set it aside. Insects building a bigger hill, she said to the empty room, and poured herself another glass of starlight wine. She had lived 4,000 years. She had seen species panic before. They always built bigger weapons, made louder noise, and then died anyway. The humans would be no different. They were too young, too fragile, too temporary to change anything. That was the story she told herself. It was the last comfortable lie she would ever believe. Ashenmore was supposed to die that day. The colony sat on the edge of human space, a mining world of red dust and iron skis where 40,000 people lived and worked in underground cities carved from ancient rock. It was not a beautiful world. It was not an important world, but it was a human world, and the Hollow were coming for it. They came out of the dark between stars like a wave of living shadow. 200 Hollow bioships, each one a massive organism of dark flesh and bone that moved through space without engines, without fuel, driven by a hunger that had no bottom. They had already consumed 3 colonies on this frontier line. Ashenmore was next. The colony's governor sent out the evacuation alarm. People ran for the deep shelters. Children screamed. Parents grabbed whatever they could carry and fled underground. Everyone knew what the Hollow did. Everyone had seen the footage. There was no fighting them. There was only running, and even that rarely worked. Except this time, something was different. Cale Morrow's fleet was waiting. 47 warships dropped out of light speed in a formation that no galactic observer had ever seen before. They were dark, angular, and they moved wrong, not in the smooth arcs of conventional ships, but in sharp, sudden shifts that seemed to skip the space between points. One moment they were here, the next they were there. No transition, no visible thrust. The Hollow swarm turned toward the new arrivals. It was an automatic response. The Hollow consumed everything that moved. They had never met anything they couldn't eat. Kale sat in the command chair of the UENS Defiance and watched the swarm approach on the tactical display. 200 bioships, each one the size of a small moon, each one carrying enough organisms inside it to strip a world bare in hours. "All ships," he said calmly. "Cascade lances free, fire at will." The universe cracked open. 47 beams of light that was not quite light reached out from the human fleet and touched the hollow swarm. Where they touched, reality folded. Bioships that had survived every weapon the frontier colonies could throw at them simply came apart. Not exploded, not burned. They unraveled as if the threads holding them together had been pulled loose by invisible fingers. Matter became energy, became nothing. In 90 seconds, the first wave of the swarm ceased to exist. The rest of the hollow ships hesitated. It was a tiny pause, barely noticeable, but Kale caught it. The hollow had never hesitated before. They didn't know how. Hesitation required the ability to recognize danger, and nothing had ever been dangerous to them. Until now. "Second volley," Kale ordered. "Push them back." The fleet advanced. Cascade lances fired again. Human frigates with their impossible hybrid drives danced between the bioships, too fast and too unpredictable to catch. Fighters launched from the carrier ships and swarmed the hollow organisms that tried to break through, their weapons burning with energy signatures that combined 3 different elder species technologies into something none of those species had ever imagined. On Ashenmoor's surface, the people in the shelters felt the ground shake. Then it stopped. Then there was silence. 40 minutes after it began, the battle was over. Every galactic news network carried the footage. It spread across the conclave worlds at the speed of light, and where it arrived, it left silence behind. On the Corvani homeworld, beings of living stone watched tiny human ships destroy things that their own fleets could not have scratched, and they did not speak for a long time. On the Vreth breeding worlds, biological masters who had shaped life for millennia watched the hollow, creatures of flesh and hunger, die screaming against weapons they could not understand, and they felt something cold move through their bodies. On Thyra Prime, in the halls of the Conclave, the delegations watched together. The chamber that had been so full of words when Kale stood before them was now silent. Nobody had a speech prepared for this. Nobody had a clever dismissal ready. The species they had called insects had just swatted something that terrified them all. Salith Von watched from her private chambers. She watched the whole recording 3 times. The third time her hands were shaking, not from fear of the hollow, from the realization that she had been completely, catastrophically wrong about the humans. The energy signatures in those weapons she recognized fragments, Elori psionic patterns, Corvani gravitational harmonics, Vreth biological structures. The humans hadn't just built new weapons. They had taken pieces of everyone's technology and woven them together into something that none of the elder species could have created alone. She sat back in her chair and said nothing for a very long time. But the celebration, if there had been one, was short-lived. 3 days after the Battle of Ashenmoor, human deep space sensors detected something that turned Kale's blood to ice. The fleet they had destroyed was not the main swarm. It wasn't even close. It was a scouting force, a test. The Hollow had sent 200 ships to see what humanity could do. The main swarm was still coming, and it was not heading for the human frontier anymore. The data arrived on Kale's screen in cold, hard numbers. 12,000 bioships, perhaps more. A mass of living darkness large enough to block out a star, and it had changed course. The main swarm was now heading directly for the galactic core, directly for Thyra Prime, directly for the elder species who thought they were safe behind their age and their power and their distance from the frontier. The Hollow were not mindless. They had been watching, learning. They had seen what the humans could do, and they had decided that the real threat was not on the frontier. The real threat was the civilization that had sat behind its walls for 10,000 years and grown soft and slow and comfortable. Kale called an emergency meeting with his commanders. The mood was grim. 47 ships and 12,000 soldiers had won the Battle of Ashenmoor. 12,000 hollow bioships would require everything humanity had and more. "We can't do this alone," said Admiral Chen, his second in command. "The math doesn't work." "I know," Kale said. "So we need the conclave." "I know that too. They told us to die quietly, sir." Kale looked at her. "And now they're about to find out what it feels like when the dying comes for them." The message arrived on Thera Prime 6 hours later. Not through diplomatic channels. Not through the Minor Concerns Committee. It arrived on every screen, every device, every broadcast system on the capital world simultaneously, because human intelligence had mapped the Conclave's communication networks years ago and had simply never used that knowledge until now. The message contained two things. First, the sensor data showing the main hollow swarm and its projected course. Second, a simple statement from Commander Morrow. "The hollow are coming for you, all of you. You have approximately 18 days before they arrive at the galactic core. My fleet is the only force in this galaxy that has successfully engaged and destroyed hollow ships. You can reach me on this channel when you're ready to talk." Panic hit the conclave like a physical blow. The elder species, who had not faced a real military threat in thousands of years, discovered that their great fleets were mostly ceremonial. Beautiful ships with outdated weapons crewed by soldiers who had never fired a shot in anger. Their defenses were designed to impress, not to fight. They had spent so long being powerful that they had forgotten what power was actually for. Salith Von opened a private channel to Kale's ship. The connection took a moment to establish, and when his face appeared on her screen, she saw that he looked tired. Not defeated, just tired. The tiredness of a man who had been carrying something heavy for a long time and still had further to walk. She did not apologize. The Elori did not apologize. But her voice, when she spoke, was stripped of the contempt she had shown in the conclave chamber. It was the voice of someone who was asking a real question for the first time in centuries. "What do you need from us, Commander?" Kale looked at her through the screen. He remembered standing alone on that chamber floor. He remembered her words. "Merely a human. Burns bright and dies fast. The galaxy will not mourn what it barely noticed." He could have been cruel. He could have made her beg. He could have thrown her words back in her face and watched her flinch. Instead, he said what needed to be said. Because there were 12,000 hollow ships coming and pettiness was a luxury he couldn't afford. "Stay out of my way or fall in line behind me. Those are your two options, High Arbiter." She stared at him for a long moment. Then she nodded once and cut the connection. That night, every sensor array in the galaxy detected the main swarm dropping out of faster-than-light travel at the edge of conclave space. It was so large that it showed up on optical telescopes as a dark stain spreading across the stars, blocking their light like a hand closing over a candle. And from the center of that darkness, a signal broadcast on every frequency in every language, but primarily in ancient Elori, a dialect so old that only Salith herself recognized it. The message was two words. "We remember you." In her chambers, Salith Von heard those words and, for the first time in 4,000 years, felt the cold touch of genuine fear. The truth came out in the worst possible way, in a room full of terrified people who needed to trust each other and suddenly couldn't. Kale had brought his fleet to Thera Prime. 47 Prometheus warships and another 60 conventional human vessels, everything Earth could spare. They joined what the elder species had managed to gather, a combined armada of over 300 ships from 9 different civilizations. It was the largest fleet ever assembled in galactic history, and Kale knew it wasn't enough. Not against 12,000. But before they could fight the enemy outside, the enemy inside had to be dealt with first. It started when human intelligence analysts examined the Hollow's broadcast message more closely. "We remember you," spoken in ancient Elori. Analysts ran the language patterns through every database they had and found something that didn't make sense. The dialect was not just old, it was a military dialect, used exclusively by Elori bioweapons research divisions during a war that had been erased from official galactic history over 8,000 years ago. Kale brought the findings to the War Council, a tense gathering of human and alien commanders aboard the largest conclave station orbiting Thera Prime. When he laid out the evidence, the room went quiet. Then everyone turned to look at Salith Vaughn. She sat perfectly still for 10 seconds. Then she spoke, and her voice was flat and empty in a way that Kale had never heard from her before. 8,000 years ago, the Elori fought a war against the Drenari Collective. We were losing. The Drenari were stronger, more numerous, and they were pushing us back system by system. So our scientists created a weapon, a living weapon, biological organisms designed to consume all organic matter in their path. We released them into Drenari space. She paused. The room was so silent that Kale could hear his own heartbeat. The weapon worked. The Drenari were destroyed. Every world, every ship, every living being, gone in less than a century. When the war was over, we sent the weapon into deep space and assumed it would die without a food source. "You assumed," Kale said. "We were wrong." The room erupted. Alien commanders shouted at each other and at Salith. Accusations flew in 12 languages. The Corvani delegation demanded to know how many other elder species had known about this. The answer was 3. 3 other species had helped the Elori build the Hollow, and all 3 had kept the secret for 8,000 years. Kale let them shout for 5 minutes. Then he stood up, and something about the way he moved made people stop talking. It wasn't authority. It wasn't rank. It was the simple, heavy presence of a man who had no time left for things that didn't matter. "We can argue about blame after we survive," he said. "Right now, there are 12,000 Hollow ships 17 days away. If anyone in this room would rather fight about the past than plan for the future, leave now. I won't stop you, but I won't wait for you either." Nobody left. Kale took command of the combined fleet. It was not a smooth process. 4 elder species admirals refused to serve under a human. One of them, a Corvani war leader named Groth, said he would rather die than take orders from a creature whose entire species was younger than his personal armor. Kale didn't argue. He simply deployed his forces for the first engagement when the Hollow Vanguard arrived 3 days ahead of the main swarm, a test force of 800 bioships that hit the outer defense line like a fist. The elder species ships fought bravely. They were not cowards, but their weapons were old, their tactics were older, and they had never faced anything like the Hollow. Within an hour, the Corvani had lost 6 ships. The Vreth had lost 4. The Thaelni defensive line was crumbling. Kale's Prometheus fleet hit the Hollow flank like a blade. Cascade lances cut through bioships. Hybrid-drive frigates appeared behind enemy formations and fired before the Hollow could turn. Human fighters, small and fast and completely reckless, flew into gaps in the Hollow swarm and detonated charges that tore holes in the living ships from the inside. The Vanguard broke. 800 bioships became 600, then 400, then 200. The survivors turned and retreated into the dark. After the battle, Groth the Corvani walked onto the bridge of the Defiance. He was enormous, nearly 3 meters tall, his body made of something between stone and metal. He stood in front of Kale and stared down at him. "Your orders, Commander," he said, "nothing else. No apology, no explanation, just the acknowledgement of a warrior who had seen another warrior fight." Kale nodded. "Get your ships repaired. The real fight starts in 14 days. Those 14 days were the longest of Kale's life. He slept in 3-hour shifts. He ate when someone put food in his hand. He planned, revised, planned again. The main Hollow swarm was 12,000 ships built around a central intelligence, a massive bioconstruct at the swarm's heart that coordinated every ship, every organism, every attack. Kill the construct and the swarm would lose its coordination. The individual ships would still be dangerous, but they would be animals without a mind. Manageable. The problem was reaching it. The construct sat at the center of 12,000 ships. Getting to it would require punching through the entire swarm. On the 10th day, Salith Vaughn came to see him. She found him alone on the observation deck of the Defiance, staring at the stars with a cup of cold coffee in his hand. "You haven't slept," she said. "I'll sleep when this is over." She stood beside him. She was taller than him by nearly a head, and she glowed faintly in the dark, her skin casting soft silver light. She had lived for 4,000 years. She had seen civilizations rise and fall. And yet, standing next to this tired, mortal man, she felt something she hadn't felt in centuries. She felt small. "I need to tell you something," she said. "The construct at the center of the swarm, it's not just a command node. It's aware, it thinks, it remembers. When we created the Hollow, we gave them a fragment of Alori consciousness to guide them. Over 8,000 years, that fragment has grown into something much larger. It hates us, Commander, not the way an animal hates. The way a child hates the parent who abandoned it." Kale looked at her. "Does it have a weakness?" "It's partially psionic. If someone could get close enough with a Cascade warhead, the detonation would disrupt its consciousness permanently. But getting close enough would mean flying directly into the center of the swarm." "How close?" "Inside it, physically inside the construct." Kale was quiet for a moment. Then he took a sip of his cold coffee and said, "Okay. Okay, Commander, what I'm describing is a one-way trip. I understood you the first time." She stared at him. "You would die." "Maybe, probably. But if it works, 12,000 ships lose their brain and your combined fleet can mop up what's left." He looked at her. "That's a good trade." "It's not a trade, it's a sacrifice." "Same thing for the person making it." The main swarm arrived on the 18th day, exactly on schedule. It filled the sky above Thera Prime like a second night, blotting out stars across half the visible sky. 12,000 bioships, each one a mountain of dark flesh and hunger, moving in perfect coordination around the vast, pulsing construct at their center. The Battle of Thyra Prime began at dawn, local time. It was the most violent event in the recorded history of the galaxy. The combined fleet met the swarm at the edge of the system. Cascade lances fired. Elder species weapons joined them. The Hollow pushed forward, absorbing losses that would have broken any other force. They adapted fast, faster than Kale had expected. Bioships began growing armor that partially deflected Cascade beams. Hollow organisms changed their attack patterns every few minutes, learning and countering human tactics in real time. Kale improvised. He had to. His plans lasted minutes before the Hollow forced him to change them. He split his fleet, reformed it, split it again. He used asteroids as cover. He detonated ships as bombs. He did things that no elder species commander would have considered because long-lived species fought conservatively. They had centuries ahead of them. They could afford to be careful. Humans couldn't. Humans had decades, not centuries. They fought with a wild, creative desperation that the Hollow's predictive models couldn't process, because no rational species would do what humans did. No rational species would charge directly into a wall of death on the chance that something unexpected might happen on the other side. The battle raged for 11 hours. Losses were staggering on both sides. But slowly, painfully, the combined fleet carved a path toward the center of the swarm. When the path was open, barely, briefly, a narrow corridor of burning space, Kale gave command of the fleet to Admiral Chen and took the helm of the Defiance himself. The ship's Cascade warhead was armed. The corridor was closing. "Commander," Salith's voice came over the comm. She was on the surface of Thyra Prime, fighting hollow organisms that had breached the planetary defenses. "The corridor won't hold for more than 4 minutes." Then I'd better hurry, Kale said. He pushed the Defiance forward. The ship screamed through the corridor as bioships closed in from every direction. Hollow organisms slammed against the hull. Armor held, then cracked, then held again. Warning lights turned the bridge red. The construct loomed ahead, a living mountain of dark flesh and ancient hatred, pulsing with the stolen consciousness of an Elori weapon that had been abandoned in the dark 8,000 years ago, and had spent every moment since learning how to suffer. Kale aimed the Defiance at its heart and did not slow down. The ship hit the construct and kept going, boring into its flesh like a needle into skin. Alarms screamed. The hull buckled. Kale's hand found the detonation switch. "Just a human," he said to nobody in particular, and pressed the button. The Cascade warhead detonated inside the construct's core. A light that was not light expanded outward, tearing through the construct's consciousness like a scream through glass. The construct shuddered. Its surface cracked. Waves of disruption rippled outward through the swarm, and 12,000 hollow bioships suddenly lost the mind that guided them. Across the battlefield, the swarm broke apart. Ships that had moved in perfect coordination began to drift, collide, turn on each other. The combined fleet surged forward and began cutting them apart. On Thera Prime, Salith Vaughn felt the psionic scream of the construct's death wash over her like a hot wind. She staggered, caught herself, and looked up at the sky where the Defiance had disappeared into the heart of the enemy. There was no signal from the ship, no beacon, no life signs. The channel was silent, and it stayed silent. The sky above Thera Prime cleared slowly, like a bruise fatting from skin. It took 3 days for the combined fleet to finish destroying the remnants of the hollow swarm. Without their central intelligence, the bioships were still dangerous but no longer coordinated. They attacked blindly, fled randomly, and died in numbers that nobody bothered to count after the first million. Pockets of hollow organisms still clung to worlds across the frontier, but the military analysts all agreed on one thing: the existential threat was over. The swarm was broken. The intelligence that had guided it for 8,000 years was gone. What remained was an extermination problem, not a war. The galaxy was saved. It took people a while to understand that. The elder species had lived with the assumption of their own safety for so long that the sudden absence of danger felt strange, like stepping off a boat and finding that the ground still seemed to move. For days, nobody celebrated. They just stood in the wreckage and tried to remember what normal felt like. On Thera Prime, the damage was severe but not total. Hollow organisms had breached the surface in 17 locations. Entire districts of the capital city were destroyed. Thousands of Elori civilians were dead, along with members of 6 other elder species who had been on-world during the siege. The crystal halls of the conclave chamber were cracked but still standing. It was in front of those cracked halls that they built the memorial. The monument was simple by conclave standards. A wall of dark stone, polished smooth, set into the ground before the chamber entrance. On it, the names of every being who had died in the Battle of Thera Prime were carved in the script of their home species. Humans, Elori, Corvani, Vreth, Thalni, and others all together, all equal, all dead for the same cause. The name at the top of the wall was Kale Morrow. Salith Vaughn carved it herself. She used a psionic blade, a tool that only the most skilled Elori could control, and she shaped each letter of his name with a precision that she hadn't applied to anything in over 1,000 years. The other conclave members watched in silence. An Elori High Arbiter, carving the name of a human with her own hands. It was the kind of thing that would have been unthinkable a month ago. A Thalni delegate, communicating through pulses of light that were translated by a device on its platform, asked her why she was doing this personally. Salith did not look up from her work. "Because I will live long enough to ensure no one forgets this name," she said. "That is the least I owe him, the very least." She finished carving and stood back. The name caught the light of the twin suns and seemed to glow against the dark stone. 2 weeks after the battle, the conclave convened for the first time since the siege. The chamber was damaged, cracks ran through the crystal walls, and one of the 12 great platforms had collapsed entirely, but the remaining delegations gathered in their places and waited. Director Lena Osei stood on the central floor where Kale had stood before. She was a tall woman with gray at her temples and a stillness about her that reminded several delegates uncomfortably of the man who had last occupied that spot. She did not beg, she did not demand, she did not threaten. She simply spoke and the chamber listened. "A month ago, a man stood where I'm standing and asked you for help. You told him no. You told him that his species was too young, too weak, too temporary to matter. He walked out of this room, went back to his people, and saved your civilization with the weapons you didn't believe he could build, the soldiers you didn't believe could fight, and the sacrifice you didn't believe he was capable of making." She paused and looked around the chamber. Every delegation was watching her. Even the Corvani, who communicated primarily through gravitational pulses, had gone perfectly still. "I'm not here to punish you for that. I'm not here to demand payment or apologies or anything else that would make this about revenge. Kale Morrow didn't fly into that swarm so that humanity could hold it over you. He did it because it needed to be done, and he was in a position to do it. That's all." She let that sit for a moment. "What I'm here to offer is a future, a real one, not the old arrangement where some species sit above others and decide who matters. A partnership, equal, open, built on the fact that we just bled together, and that should count for more than how old our civilizations are or how long our people live." She placed a data pad on the podium. "This is a proposal for a new governing body. We're calling it the Galactic Accord. Full partnership, technology sharing, mutual defense. Every species gets an equal voice from the oldest to the youngest. You can read the details at your leisure." She stepped back from the podium. "We didn't fight for a seat at your table. We built our own, but there's room at it for everyone." The vote was not immediate. The elder species were old, and old things move slowly. But the debates were shorter than anyone expected, because the memory of those 12,000 hollow ships was still fresh, and the memory of what had stopped them was fresher. The Galactic Accord was ratified unanimously 11 days later. On the day the accord was signed, a search and rescue frigate operating in the debris field of the destroyed hollow construct detected a faint energy signature. It was weak, intermittent, and buried under layers of dead organic matter that was slowly breaking apart in the vacuum of space. The crew almost missed it. They were tired, running on little sleep, and the debris field was enormous. But the sensor officer was a young woman named Rivera who had served on the frontier and had learned that the difference between life and death was often one person paying attention when everyone else had stopped. She flagged the signal. The frigate changed course. They found the escape pod wedged inside a cavity in the construct's remains, surrounded by dead tissue that had hardened around it like a fist. The pod was tiny, barely large enough for one person. Its hull was cracked. Its power supply was nearly gone. Its life support had failed 8 days ago. Inside, held alive by an exoframe that had rerouted every remaining watt of power to keeping his heart beating and his brain oxygenated, was Kale Morrow. He was not conscious. His body temperature was dangerously low. His right arm was broken in 3 places. His lungs had partially collapsed. By every reasonable medical standard, he should have been dead several times over. But the exoframe had been designed by human engineers who did not accept the concept of should have been dead. It had a survival protocol that was, in the words of its designer, offensively optimistic. It had sealed his wounds, managed his breathing, slowed his metabolism, and kept his brain alive through methods that would later make Vreth biological scientists write extremely long papers full of words like impossible and unprecedented. They brought the pod aboard the frigate. The medical team worked on him for 6 hours. Then they put him on the fastest ship available and sent him to Thyra Prime, because the best medical facilities in the galaxy were there, and because someone had already contacted the Conclave. Kale woke up in a medical bay that smelled like flowers he didn't recognize. The ceiling above him was crystal. Light moved through it in slow, gentle patterns that might have been natural or might have been designed to calm patients. He didn't know where he was. He didn't know what day it was. He wasn't entirely sure he was alive. He turned his head slowly, because everything hurt, and saw Salith Vaughn standing beside his bed. She looked different from how he remembered her. In the conclave chamber, she had been a figure of cold authority, ancient and untouchable. Now she just looked like a person. A very old person who had been standing beside his bed for a long time and was trying to find words that her 4,000 years of life hadn't prepared her for. She looked at him, he looked at her. "You are merely a human, Commander," she said. Her voice was quiet. There was no contempt in it. There was something else entirely, something that sounded like it had been pulled from a place she had forgotten existed. Kale smiled. It hurt his face, cracked his dry lips, and pulled at wounds that hadn't finished healing. But it was a real smile, the kind that starts in the chest and works its way up. "Yeah," he said. His voice was a rough whisper, barely audible. That was always enough. Salith Vaughn, High Arbiter of the Elari, 4,000 years old, survivor of wars and ages and the slow death of stars, stood beside the bed of a 41-year-old human soldier, and did something she had not done since she was young enough to still believe the universe was kind. She smiled back. In the months that followed, the galaxy changed. The Galactic Accord established its first joint councils. Technology flowed freely between species for the first time. Human engineers worked alongside Elori psionics, Corvani physicists, and Vreth biologists, and the things they created together made Prometheus look like a child's toy. The frontier colonies were rebuilt, stronger than before, with defenses that every Accord species contributed to. Kale Morrow, after 3 months of recovery that he complained about constantly, was appointed as humanity's first ambassador to the Galactic Accord. He accepted the position on the condition that his office have a window. Salith Vaughn personally arranged for him to have quarters in the rebuilt conclave complex, with a view that stretched across the crystal mountains of Thyra Prime to the horizon. On the wall of his office next to the window, he hung the photograph of Mara and Elise. They smiled in sunlight from a world that no longer existed, and every morning Kale looked at them and remembered why he had done what he had done. Not for glory, not for revenge, not even for humanity, for them, for the idea that no one should have to lose what he had lost because the powerful decided the powerless didn't matter. On a warm evening, 6 months after the battle, Kale stood at his window and watched the first ship of a new deep space expedition launch from Thyra Prime's orbital station. It was a joint vessel, human design, Elori navigation, Corvani engines, Vreth life support. It carried a crew from 11 species, and it was heading beyond the edge of the galaxy, into the void between stars where nothing had gone before. On its hull, painted in every language of the Accord, was a single line: "Further together." Kale watched it go until it was just another point of light among the stars. Then he picked up his coffee, which was cold because it was always cold, and went back to work. There was a galaxy to build, and they were merely human. But that had always been enough.